Okay, here we go. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is. I hope it's good to be where you are, because it is certainly good to be here. My name is Baltimore Fats, and welcome to Baltimore. Yeah! Okay, let's hope I nail this one, all right? Like I nailed that intro. Okay, so here we go. We're going with Baltimore, and just going to dive right in. But Baltimore is a complicated story. And what I've discovered while rabbit holing it over the last, 2 or 3 months or whatever, since February, when things really started to come together after the Walking, Waking, Delusional videos, in terms of what I was experiencing in my chronicling of, Mud Event Baltimore. And when I mentioned that in the previous video, that I felt that Baltimore really is going to be the culmination of Mud City, because it's really been telling itself throughout Mud City right from the beginning, right from my very first video where we get into King Gambrinus, right, through the finding of the Gordon building and the Star of David in the circles at the top, right, through Orpheus on Locust Point in episode 1, to the faces on the old police building, and going through the weird history of the Barons Baltimore, and picking up through the carols and that history. And that's really going to be, I'm going to go over more of this again in Baltimore, because Baltimore definitely has a stop. It followed me to Asheville. I found all those Greek figures on the sides of the buildings in Asheville, and just then through finding the Walking, Waking, Delusional tour. This concept of Baltimore as a Roman cult city of, like a fertility cult center, that was used in part to repopulate after the Mud Event or whatever thing had happened, and they wanted to stage the reality that we have today. And I'm going to talk more about that as we go along. So, to me, it really feels like a really organic experience coming through and then coming to this information the way that I have. And, I feel blessed by it, really. And so before I get going, I wanted to just thank everybody that's ever watched a minute of my videos or commented or anything. I appreciate all of it. And I certainly, wouldn't be the same show without any of that. So thank you all, really. And so moving on now into what got me going on Baltimore and in the Walking Delusional, Waking Delusional tour was the B&O Railroad building. And on the side of this building was the Lady of Elche, or Elche. I don't know how to say it. So doing due diligence, I wanted to find out, get rid of that. I wanted to find out more about the Lady of Elche. And so it was discovered in 1897 on a private estate south of Elche, Spain. All right. And here she is, very famous, right? Seen all over the Discovery Channel and the History Channel and Ancient Aliens, I'm sure. And so they say it's an Iberian artifact from the 4th century BC, although the artisanship suggests strong Hellenistic influences. And this is the area that's the Hellenism, and this is where Baltimore is taking me, and it's going to bring it all up through it. The Lady of Elche is believed to have a direct association with Tanit, the goddess of Carthage, who was worshipped by the Punic Iberians. And so I'm going to get more into her. I'm going to get deep into the Lady of Elche and the gods, but I have to go forward a little bit just because it ties it all into the Roman cult center that's here in Baltimore. And so Tanit was the Punic and Phoenician goddess, the chief deity of Carthage, alongside her consort Baal Haman. And so there's the Baal. And I'm going to get deep into those practices. But one thing I wanted to stress was that in both cases, for Tanit and for Baal Haman, they're fertility gods. Baal Haman is like king of the gods. He's a weather god. But Tanit, she is the face of Baal, right? And where do they show her as the face of Baal? Here somewhere. This is Tanit with a lion's head. I don't know. That's a lion's head. That's what Baal is supposed to look like. But here she was. Not only was she consort of Baal Haman, but she was a heavenly goddess of war, right? Virginal mother goddess, and less specifically a symbol of fertility, as most female forms were. But she demanded child sacrifice, as did Baal Haman. And again, this ties into the overall feeling, atmosphere I get from Baltimore walking around, that was part of its Roman cult aesthetic or whatever, its existence, in the 1800s and earlier, up through the early 1900s probably as well. Like I said, because it was my theory that it's World War II is where the switch was really flicked, and everything changes after World War II. So she's on the side of the B&O building, and so I wanted to get into the building, like who would put the main deity of Carthage, who demands child sacrifice, a fertility goddess, on the side of the B&O building in Baltimore? I mean, how does that fit, And so I wanted to look more closely at the building. And so we're going to go into it a little bit. It was constructed between 1904 and 1906. I'm going to read ahead a little bit, but I'm going to come back to this. It was designed by the architectural firm of Parker and Thomas of Baltimore and Boston, with the assistance of these guys. And they had a construction firm listed of the brothers W.W. and E.A. Wells of Chicago. And that's interesting to me because I don't often see like construction firms, like who actually built it. I always see architect names, but I rarely see construction company names. And so I looked this one up, and the only reference I could find, and it was, you see, like here they pull things like, this is not E.A. Wells Construction Company, right? They pull weird stuff together. But there is a Wells Construction Company listed in this one from 1902, which is of that era, so perhaps there's some legitimacy there that they did work there, or that there was that construction company that they did some work on the B&O building. If they didn't build it outright, who's to say? Because the story of the architects gets really interesting. So I wanted to read ahead a little bit on the current tenants are it's a Hotel Monaco, and on their website page they talk about the opening of the building, right? And it says the B&O headquarters opened its doors at midnight on September 12, 1906. To the dazzling spectacle of more than 5,000 electric lights that burst into fire and presented a grand spectacle, as reported by the Baltimore Sun. The newspaper went on to point out that Oscar G. Murray, B&O Railroad president, chose to move into his office suite the next day, September 13th. The structure is 13 stories high. Murray started in the railroad business on January 13th, 1872, and he was elected the 13th president of the railroad. Furthered the news report. Of course, Murray's office number was 13. Of course it was. And his phone extension was the same. So Oscar G. Murray really loved him some 13s. But I want to say it's interesting that they opened its doors at midnight. This giant spectacle. And so I wanted to find out about the opening. And unfortunately, the original rabbit hole that I came to, I could not duplicate. So I had to cheat. But essentially what happened was they created the Baltimore Jubilee. And I'm going to read a little bit about what the Baltimore Jubilee was, and then I'm going to get back to the architects of the building and close this one out as chapter 1 of Baltimore. So here's some pictures of it. And I'm going to read, and then I'll show the pictures. All right, so this was in September of 06, right? And so they talk about remembering September 11th. But on September 9th in 1906 was Jubilee Week, a week-long series of events and parades that marked the city's renaissance after the Great Baltimore Fire of 1904. It was also a civic outpouring that publicly thanked the firefighters who had so bravely risked their lives saving their city from the conflagration. So here it says, within 2 years, Baltimore had snapped back from the edge of ruin. Visitors in 1906 called the reconstruction unbelievable. Photographs of the renewed district did not show how Baltimore still lacked a sewer system or that it remained one of the last major cities to modernize its approach for dealing with wastewater. But it looked good. And this is amazing here. It said, in the 2 years of the reconstruction, it gave way to 800 modern buildings. The streets were widened and the harbor was revitalized with new docks and wharves in 2 years. And so on September 13th, there was a parade. There was a whole week. They did this for a whole week to celebrate Baltimore coming back from the fire. And I'm going to get deeper into the Jubilee in episode 2 because I want to now get back to the architects, because it was a very important thing, this building, among all those buildings that were being built or rebuilt post-fire. So the architectural firm was Parker and Thomas. Now, J. Harleston Parker's the Boston connection, and it's Thomas who's the Baltimore. And so I'm not going to get into Parker at all because I don't need to, right? This is all about Baltimore, right? So it took some doing, but I had to look up Thomas, right? And here he is, Douglas H. Thomas, born 1872, died 1915. And he was one of the more distinguished Baltimore architects in the early years of the 20th century. He was the son of a prominent Baltimore banker, and he attended local schools until 16, and then he went abroad for a year of study at the Lausanne in Switzerland. Upon his return, he entered the Johns Hopkins University, from which he graduated in 1893. Then the next 2 years found him studying architecture at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, followed by study in Paris, and then eventually Italy and Greece. I mean, think about the traveling and the education that Dougie here had. Unbelievable. And so when you think about the type of person who would put the Roman goddess, chief goddess, who demanded fertility goddess, who demanded child sacrifice, this guy has opportunity to learn all of that, not to mention from the Lady of Elk, who was in Paris, I think, at this time. After she was discovered, or when it might have been in Paris when he was there, because it was discovered, 1897 it said? Right, and then it went to the Louvre. So he could have been intimately familiar with the Lady of Elche and, the Iberian religion and the Carthaginian religion. All right, and so upon his return, he starts hooking up with some architectural firms, but it's Baltimore where his biggest achievements lay. And they mentioned the Belvedere and the Baltimore, Ohio building and stuff he did for Johns Hopkins. And then it says here, Douglas Thomas met an untimely and tragic death on June 11th, 1915. Driving from the city to his country home in the evening, his car overturned on a slippery hill, and he was crushed beneath it. And I think about this date of 1915 and the type of cars that there were, and I didn't go looking, but I'm thinking like these giant Model T Fords, right? They were massive, heavy steel machines, and having one flip over on a slippery hill. I don't know. I have to do some research on that. To me, I mean, maybe there was a slippery hill and he fell off a cliff. I don't know what would cause a Model T to flip over on a slippery hill. in the, driving to his country home outside of Baltimore City. But I wanted to find out more about this family, right? Because his father was a prominent banker, and so I wanted to see what I could find out about his father. And I found in the Maryland Historical Society they have an archive for him, right? And it contains newspaper clippings related to his life and career, and they document the senior Thomas's involvement in Baltimore politics, his banking career, and his interest in American history and genealogy. Like, his interest in American history, not the American history maybe that he's helping to, the false narrative he's helping to create, he and his buddies, all right, and the genealogy of the helping repopulate the post-reset world. I don't know. That's what that says to me. All right, and so when he was young, this is senior now, our architect's father. All right, when he was a lad, he tried to join the Confederate Army, but was caught by federal officials and returned to Maryland. After the Civil War, notice 1867, he joins the 5th Maryland Regiment, where he gets promoted all the way to major. So at one point, he could be considered a deserter, and he gets promoted to major. Right? Then he worked in the banking industry for the majority of his career and was employed by the Farmers and Merchants Banks, Marine Bank, and finally Merchants National Bank, where he was elected president in 1886. From defector to president of a bank in 25 years or less. So that's amazing, right? And so he was appointed to several government posts, such as the Baltimore Street Paving Commission, and considered running for mayor of Baltimore. So he's responsible for paving the streets in the early days of the brick streets, the cobblestone streets, and the early concrete pavement of streets. And it's kind of weird that his kid would be killed on a slippery road that his father may have been responsible for. I don't know. The story gets even crazier. Trust me. So I wanted to look up Senior's father, and I couldn't really find much on Senior's father, but I was able to find something, but it was through his grandfather, and I'm going to talk about his grandfather because his grandfather is a very interesting story. And his grandfather's name was Philip Thomas, and he was Frederick's physician. He was a patriot of 76. All right, and so now this is our architect's great-grandfather. All right, Philip Thomas was born on the 11th day of June, 1747. Now, he was born on the 11th day of June when his great-grandson meets an untimely death on June 11th, 1915. I don't know. I don't know how coincidental that could be, but, the great-grandfather is born on the 11th of June. The great-grandchild is killed on the 11th of June. I'm sure there's all kinds of havoc that can be wreaked with the gematria there. All right? So he takes up an interest in medicine at an early age, and he goes to Philadelphia to study under Thomas Van Dyke, and he attended professional lectures by the most prominent medical minds and physicians of the day. Right? He attended William Smith's lectures on natural and experimental philosophy. He matriculated in the college that would one day be known as the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine. This was the first and only medical school in the 13 colonies then, in the fall of 1765. They created a first university in North America though the corporate name continued to be the College of Philadelphia. And that's the Quakers. They talk about his, who he learned under, and this John Morgan was schooled at the University of Edinburgh. So you have your blue and white a part of that equation. So, but he couldn't afford to stay there. He couldn't afford a medical degree. So he completed an apprenticeship and obtained letters of recommendation, and then started his own practice in Frederick, where he marries up. He marries into the Hanson family, and John Hanson would would be the first president of the Congress assembled, essentially the first president of the United States. Although here it says third overall, so I'm not necessarily clear on that. So, which now then in turn makes our architect's great great grandfather, John Hanson, first president of the United States. And tying this, he puts that Roman goddess, the Iberian Carthaginian goddess, on the side of the building, and it's not a coincidence. And those dates of birth and death for these guys are not a coincidence. So they talk about his practice. So he's very active in the Revolution, and he earned a reputation as being highly patriotic, as was Frederick the Town. And he became a member of Frederick's Committee of Safety, which comprised of the Committee of Observation and the Committee of Correspondence, which makes me wonder how many committees people need. And so these committees included area's Sons of Liberty and other diehard patriots. They became a shadow government on the local level, slowly taking control of the 13 colonies away from royal officials, rendering them helpless. And here it says, these committees required oversight of local activities and allegiances and precipitated correspondence and communication between towns and colonies. It was Homeland Security long before Homeland Security Department. Yeah. So what they're saying is that the Homeland Security has been here all along, right from Jump Street. From before the American Revolution, we had these checks and balances that essentially were the Department of Homeland Security. Right? And it was chaired by John Hanson, of course, the first president. There's our guy. He's looking rather dour there, not so happy. Kind of looks like a Carol there, too. So at a young age, still at 28, he serves in the General Congress in Annapolis. Right? And he fights with the Continental Army. And he helps out Washington at Yorktown, and he gets rewarded for that. But after the war, he builds his medical practice, and he does house calls. He's very giving of his time, and he'll travel 150 miles. He helps somebody come out of a coma with the right medicines. But here, it's also, he was appointed as a federal revenue inspector and collector, a likely payback from President George Washington for Thomas's earlier service and support. So he becomes like a tax collector, revenue inspector and collector. What does that mean? But this, I'm going to try to remember to leave a link, but this is a funny article to read. And he talks about if you owe him money, it's time to pay up. So, I don't know. I think it's pretty amazing. And I forgot there was one aspect I must have passed over. Here it is. In 1781, he was commissioned as captain of the Frederick Light Dragoons. And so I had to look that up because it just cracked me up, the Light Dragoons. Because it makes me think light dragons. But here they are, pomp and circumstance. I don't know what their function is in the army. There's their insignia. But it's interesting, though, that when your first Google search for this, for dragoon, will bring up like these crazy art. And this is from like Final Fantasy games or stuff. And so they made dragoon something really cool instead of this. I don't know. So he was a light dragoon as well, Philip Thomas, and that makes me think light dragon, and of course dragons and worms and worm knights, and that's all going to come in. And so it all ties back to the B&O building. And so it was my intention, I'm going to wrap this up here because it was my intention originally to do like a much longer one and get all into the Jubilee and stuff, but I had this tragedy happen to me this morning because I was going to use the Baltimore Sun archives through the Enoch Pratt Library, and I was all excited. I was going to record like 6 hours of this today, see if I could knock it all out in a day, and barely knocking out a half an hour's worth. But don't! My library card expired in the last week or so since I last did this, so I have to go back and do that. So the next episode is going to start with the Jubilee and bringing it back further into the old religions and things like this. But I wanted to close out with this image of the B&O building Because one of the things that I've been doing, and it is going to play a factor when I get more into Baal, is I've been looking at the reflections of windows when I take pictures. And, there's some like crazy like reflections in here, and these patterns. I don't know if they really mean anything or say anything, but I'm interested in them, and I've been interested in the things that I've been catching off of reflections, like in that. I don't think I got to it. I have a building that I will get to that has some cool reflections in it. But so I was looking around and looking around in reflections, and I found this guy. Look at him looking at me. All right, there's nobody else in any of these windows. Now, I had been out and about in front of this building taking pictures all, I don't know, 20 minutes or so, all right? So I'm sure word got up to somebody that there was somebody taking pictures of the building outside. And look, we have all kinds of stuff up here that I have not investigated. Can we get in on that? Well, anyway, so I'm sure it's just him looking at it. But when I first saw this, I was like, it's the ghost of Oscar G. Murray on the 13th floor, the number 13. But no, because it's the 12th floor. But anyway, can I get up close just to wrap this up? Let's see what's up there. We got the, what was that, the Caudicus or whatever? It's on both sides, yeah. Anyway, okay, so that's closing out Chapter 1, the B&O Railroad Building of Baltimore. And it's going to be a little mini-series. I don't know how many episodes, but it's definitely something that's finite. And it's going to move the story forward into Baltimore. And so I'm really excited about it. And once again, I just want to thank everybody who is coming along with me on this one. And until the next one, cheers, guys.